I first got interested in Louden stuff right off the bat, and one of the many inventions he was the first guy with round barn hay trolleys that ran in circular barns, and he came up with a system to do that. And so from the get-go, I was interested in Louden. Bill Louden was, just one amongst us that showed up on a stagecoach from Burlington in rural Fairfield, Iowa. And when you see the proliferation of his work, if you're a hay trolley collector, which was massive, and his proliferation of the barn book and all the equipment that was used in dairy barns and for farming and so forth, you have to first say, whoa, this guy is a pretty special guy. There weren't a lot of guys running around Fairfield, Iowa that had his acumen for solving problems. His passion was about lifting the load off the backs of farmers. So you start adding all that up and you say, well, this is a pretty interesting fellow in the neighborhood here, and we need to do some more digging about him and his background and what made him so successful, because it was obvious that he was one of the most successful guys in this field. So Louden's origins, from childhood through successful businessman, was always Fairfield, where all the marketing was, the history was there, the factory was there, the foundry was there. So the long history of Bill Louden, and not only growing up, but his business thing was always associated with Fairfield. And later in his life, he invented a lot of things. He had 118 patents, but all mainly focused on farming activities and reducing labor on the farmer. But that Louden, Fairfield was always home to Louden, and it's on every single piece of equipment that he sold. So some of Bill Louden's personal attributes that really caused him to be so successful as an inventor really got down to the fact that he was unable to do a lot of farm chores because of his disabilities, but his mind worked perfectly. And he would simply look at things, and I'm sure he must have studied physics, and there's a thing in physics called foot-pounds of work. How many pounds do you lift something and how many feet do you carry it? Well, if you're not sweating through the process and you're sitting there thinking, the first thing that occurs to you, there must be a better way to do this. There has to be better ways to do this. He was always trying to do it with the least possible resources. And if you study his background, his school teacher for 3 years, he was a conservationist. He believed in doing the most you could do with the least amount of materials. And you'll see through the first 25 years of his inventing of hay trolleys, when he went from the wooden era over to the cast iron era, he was constantly making these things smaller and smaller, because smaller meant they were easier for the farmer to use, and smaller meant that they cost less money, and smaller meant that you could ship them at a much lower cost than shipping something that weighed 10 times as much. Ultimately, hay trolleys were just like television sets in my day. Nobody had them, and then within 3 or 4 years, everybody had them. So he basically went from a situation where there were no competitors doing this till it got very popular, and neighbors started seeing other neighbors saying, hey, there's a better way to do this, Charlie, than putting it up there by hand. And so the market really took off with a shot in the 1880s, and you had to be competitive. And his conservation mentality really served him well. So one thing that's not understood by my generation or the generation before was the Great Depression of 1873. It's not heard of much, or I'm sure you get it in the history book, but it's not nearly as well known as the Depression of 1931 or whatever. But in 1873, about everybody went bankrupt. It wasn't just Bill Louden. I mean, if you were in business, you were in trouble. It was so bad that the U.S. government at one point started buying back dollar bills with gold coins. I mean, that's how bad it was. And so then things got better by 1879, and he decided to form a company, and then his brother R.B. came up a couple years later from Kansas City as an attorney. Brothers don't always get along, but in this case, they really complemented one another, because Louden was a hands-on guy. He understood the business. He understood the farmers, he understood the customers, and I think he had a pretty good idea that competition was on the horizon. And his brother came with business skills, legal skills. He was in the real estate business, so he knew all about marketing and selling, and he knew about financing. That was the hub of the whole operation was Fairfield, Iowa. There was manufacturing went on there, distribution went on there, and they did have warehouse service centers. Not so many. I think they had 4 or 5 in the United States, one out east, one up in Minnesota, and so forth and so on. Louden was, his marketing approach of the Louden enterprise was to sell directly through hardware stores. And that meant that his name went on just about all of his product that he sold, and it was prominently displayed. About the turn of the century, many of his competitors, and they were significant at the time, decided that they were going to go the Walmart of the day. They were going to sell through the mail order houses in Chicago. So everybody and their uncle was beating a path to Chicago to sell things through Sears and Montgomery Ward. That was starting to take over as a major element. Louden didn't go that way. The people that went that way big time were Janesville Hay Tool and Milwaukee Hay Tool, but their name was not on anything because Sears and Ward's and the catalog houses wanted their names on the product or no names on the product. And the only 2 major competitors that still went the direct route of going from factory to hardware stores to farmer was Louden and obviously Myers from Ashland. So it was a different marketing philosophy, but because he was a direct sale guy through hardware stores, his name went on all of his products. So part of what became very popular with Louden in the 20s is he filled out his product line. And remember, his product line was around barns and dairy and farming operations. So he basically had cookie cutter barn designs, and he probably had 20 or 30 of them, depending on how many dairy cows you had, because remember, he's a customer-oriented guy. You got to start with the cows. So he had all these barn designs, but cleverly, they all included plenty of Louden equipment. You know, you got to have Louden barn door rollers, Louden ventilators, Louden stanchions for the cows, Louden watering cups for the cows to drink out of, a Louden hay trolley. And so part of his so-called barn design thing was helping farmers design, zero in on what size barn they wanted and what kind of equipment they needed. And it was very successful. And they put out a whole series of pamphlets in outlining different barn designs. So when he got in the design business, it was really for 2 reasons. One, to help farmers zero in on what kind of a barn they needed, and obviously number 2, to fill it with Louden equipment. But there was an exposition around 1950 before the outbreak of World War I. And he was in a booth just like the booth behind me. And somebody walked up from the government and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Say, we sure could use one of your overhead systems to help us in the war effort." He said, "There's many factories where we're lifting things and carrying things and putting them on carts and moving them around. And it sure would be nice if you can figure out how to make this trolley system work in these factory settings." And he went home to Fairfield and talked to the troops at work, and he was totally against, "I'm not going to do that." He said, that's too dangerous. I don't want to get involved in that. They came back a second time and put a heavy arm on him and said, "Look, you need to help us with the war effort, and not on an optional basis." People were trying to make all sorts of war goods and things that had to be picked up and lifted and moved around. And so Louden decided, once he got his mind around it, okay, we're going to go into overhead rail systems and cranes and hoists. And he went into a full product line, which really sustained the company, I'd say, from the 20s all the way up to 1950 was primarily that, because by then most of the barn market had matured. The barns had been built, and yeah, people built a barn here or there, but nothing like the settling period of time in the country when barns were settled. So he got in through World War I into this overhead crane thing, and it kept the company going for another 30 years. So once you build, like Louden did, a successful business enterprise, there's all sorts of demands on you. People coming wanting this, wanting that. There are manufacturing problems. There's employee problems. There's, you name it, you got problems. Well, RB came in and he took a lot of the load of those kind of problems off of his back and let Louden sort of be the front man for the company, but also stay focused on what he liked to do, which was invent, spend time with farmers, figure out ways of building a better mousetrap. He was obviously a very competitive guy, not willing to take a back seat to any other company in his field. So I think RB's coming in helped him a lot, take a lot of administrative things away, because I know a lot of early inventors, they'll have some early success, and then the company starts getting big, and as soon as you hire the first person, that's your first problem, and then you hire 3 or 4, and then you wake up one day and you got 20 screaming eagles. And if I don't know, it's Zenith in Fairfield, but they must have had hundreds of employees, and that's a lot of load. It's a lot of managerial load on anybody, and I think RB came in and took a lot of that off of his back, which allowed him late in his career to keep on pushing the original idea. And I think that was a very big piece of the puzzle. And when I look at these Louden catalogs and all the marketing they did and the sales literature they put out and so forth, I think RB came along, and that's something he must have had from his real estate background, savvy in, and it helped him a bunch. So, the two brothers together made a real go of it. But I think that kept Louden, the entrepreneur, the inventor, and so forth, helped keep him on track and not let the business drag him off of his main mission. But the thing he'll be remembered for most is the legacy he left in the farming community of this country. And he was a major iconic guy in the agricultural industry, and saying who else measures up to his standard of impact. You get back to these guys like McCormick and Deering and all these people that were early on guys. That's sort of what I think he'll be remembered for the most. And he was obviously the most prolific inventor that they'd ever seen in town. 118 versus I don't know whatever was next, but it'd be way down the list. He'll be remembered as a labor-saving guy in agriculture and industry as well.